Aphorism 4. The falseness of a judgment is to us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. It is here that our new language perhaps sounds strangest. The question is, to what extent is it life-advancing, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-breeding? And our fundamental tendency is to assert that the falseless judgments to which synthetic judgments a priori belong are the most indispensable to us, that without granting as true the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the purely invented world of the unconditional and self-identical, without a continual falsification of the world by means of numbers, mankind could not live. That to renounce false judgments would be to renounce life, would be to deny life, to recognize untruth as a condition of life. That, to be sure, means to resist customary value sentiments in a dangerous fashion, and a philosophy which ventures to do so places itself, by that act alone, beyond good and evil. Aphorism 5. What makes one regard philosophers half mistrustfully and half mockingly is not that one again and again detects how innocent they are, how often and how easily they fall into error and go astray, in short, their childishness and childlikeness, but that they display altogether insufficient honesty, while making a mighty and virtuous noise as soon as the problem of truthfulness is even remotely touched on. They pose as having discovered and attained their real opinions through the self-evolving of cold, pure, divinely unperturbed dialectic, in contrast to the mystics of every rank, who are more honest and more stupid than they. These speak of inspiration, while what happens at bottom is that a prejudice, a notion, a inspiration, generally a desire of the heart stiffed and made abstract, is defended by them with reasons sought after the event. They are one and all advocates who do not want to be regarded as such, and for the most part no better than cunning pleaders for their prejudices, which they baptize truths, and very far from possessing the courage of the conscience which admits this fact to itself, they very far from possessing the good taste of the courage which publishes this fact, whether to warn a foe or a friend, or out of high spirits, or in order to mock itself. The Tartuffery, as stiff as it is virtuous, the old grand Kant, as he lures us along with the dialectical bypaths, which led more correctly, misled, to his categorical imperative. This spectacle makes us smile, we who are facetious and have no little amusement in observing the subtle tricks of old moralists and moral preachers, not to mention that the hocus pocus of mathematical form in which, as an iron, Spinoza encast and masked his philosophy, the love of his wisdom, to render that word fairly and squarely, so as to strike terror into the heart of any assailant who should dare to glance at that invincible maiden in Pallas Athena. How much personal timidity and vulnerability this masquerade of a sick recluse betrays. Welcome again. Previously, not on Dragon Ball Z, as I said, the previous episode, but previously we read and analyzed Aphorism 2 and 3 of Part 1 of Beyond Good and Evil, discussing in in Aphorism 2, the first half, where he's sarcastically imitating a philosopher who's in fear, dumbfoundedness, and at the same time offended or provoked that his philosophy is a will to deception and selfish action to, well, unconscious selfish action to control and reflect his philosophy on another person so they can reflect what he said to other people, thus creating a philosophical virus or conscience and mental and moral virus among the individuals he infected. Hence him saying that the fundamental faith of metaphysicians is the faith in antithetical values. And then it clarifies everything, what he said with Aphorism 2 to Aphorism 3, that unconscious thinking, or conscious thinking, including the instincts and philosophical thinking, are tied, but behind every singular logic of the philosophical and conscious thinking is a preservation from a physiological demand that was channeled from his instincts of this specific species of life. Now to grab from the ether and heavens and decipher everything what Nietzsche said, watch the previous video. But today, we discuss both 4 and 5. In the first sentence of 4, people can't grasp what Nietzsche's saying. Again, he wrote for a minority of noble, strong-minded individuals. With the first sentence, the falseness of a judgment is to us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. Why is it ostensible to this judgment? Because it's an ontological or being preference and perspective of a judgment. While denying, disagreeing, and saying that it's a false judgment for us, it will be a true judgment to another person. A true and preferable judgment to another person. It doesn't suit our agenda, actions, decisions, fate, etc., etc. It's not entirely an objection to this specific judgment. And he continues saying, the question is, to what extent is this life preserving, advancing, plus species preserving and breeding, with asserting that these false judgments, including if it's indispensable for us. He's saying, while we are denying these judgments, while other people aren't denying these judgments with, quote, our new language perhaps sounds strangest, including the question to what degree of what we deny is beneficial to another person, but because it's beneficial to another person, to what extent or degree is it preserving, expanding, and breeding this form of life and species. Plus, if it's preserving and expanding or breeding this specific judgment or mode of judgment with these people, will they continue that judgment and worsen or advance it depending on the interpretation of the judgment itself? And while Nietzsche is deciphering this, and he has, well, not deciphering, but while I'm deciphering this, he realized that with that statement, that ontological statement, or the study of the being, how is this mode of being contributing to the degree if it's life-affirming or life-denying? To simplify, are they a yes-sayer to life, or are they a no-sayer to life? And while he's asserting this, he includes synthetic judgments a priori. He's including Kantian synthetic judgments a priori to his false judgments, where why synthetic judgments a priori are necessary. They're unnecessary. And he'll continue with this dialogue of, well, it's unnecessary, and another aphorism. Now, if it's indispensable to us, depending on the judgment, if it's true or false to us, and including that he's denying and criticizing the absolute knowledge in spirit from Hegel. So it's a double criticism, one for Kant and one for Hegel, and the entire German idealism, Faust, Schelling, etc., etc. And he continues that without granting as true the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the purely invented world, including unconditional and self-identical, or falsification of the world by means of the numbers, humans could not live. Criticizing the dependency of logic, measuring this reality to a false apparent, not apparent, but a false, to them it's a true world. He'll say in Trial of the Idols that the apparent world was here while the true world was linely added. And he'll expound on what he's saying here in Twilight of the Idols and in Genealogy of Morals, if you in between the black and white lines, both psychologically and physically on paper. So while we're dependent on what the self-identical, unconstitutional, the measuring of reality, comparing it to other realities, numbers, and logic, he's saying, well, that would just be renouncing false judgments on its own. Well, if these false judgments are tied with life, then you're denying life. He continues saying, as a 180 compliment, to recognize untruth as a condition of life, that would be to resist the customary mode of values in a dangerous fashion. And a philosophy which does this by act alone is beyond good and evil. That sentence right there is define what the title is. Now, yes, there's a subtitle of Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, and connecting that to Aphorism 2 of him saying, to all speak in all seriousness, I see such new philosophers arising. It's how you connect this work. Yes, it's complex, nuanced, and radically in one position to another position, and not fluid. But the fluid is a form, while the function's everything. This function's great. Once you continue tying one sentence to another sentence, and you have a cohesion of what he's saying, and sometimes he's talking from his ass. Once he does that, it's difficult to grasp what he's saying from that day, depending on his condition of the vomiting, nausea, the headaches, migraines, etc., etc., and the blinding of the tumor in the back of his right eye, that he was becoming blind in the right eye, etc., etc. So once you read Beyond Good and Evil, or after Thus Spoke Zarathustra, remember in your head of Nietzsche's condition and emotions that day from the Measure of Pain. But time to correlate what he was saying of Beyond Good and Evil, and he sees new philosophers rising. He's saying new philosophers, rising and beyond good and evil, and two different aphorisms, because with the person that's beyond good and evil, mediocrity, social norms, and philosophy itself, with his affirmation of life and personal table of values, while he has faith inside himself as a true creator, not dependent on others, while he overcomes mediocrity, etc., etc. Overcoming is a pinnacle for to conquer and overcome mediocrity. He's saying with a person that's has this dangerous fashion that acts alone and realizes that this untruth is becoming a condition, that this truth that everybody posits every day to everyday life is an untruth and has become a traditional condition of life, but because he has the truth and not this untruth, he says that this truth that he sees every day is untruth. So now he renounces those false judgments and their truth of life, while he doesn't renounce his form of life and judgments. This correlates with the lion and who is one of the three metamorphoses in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, who scornfully says no to traditional norms, concepts, and morality, and who has a continual battle with this golden scale dragon, and every vibrant scale is saying thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt, as a golden rule that thou shalt do this and you shouldn't do this. Tying fiction with this a fictional work that uses that uses both fictional and non-fictional language, tying it with beyond good and evil. Next to Aphorism 5. While criticizing philosophers and their prejudice still, is he's saying that they are half mistrustful and half cunning again and again, but they appear as innocent. Now, this is a familiar tread and rhythm of Nietzsche. He's saying, yeah, they're doing this, this, and this, but at the same time, they appear as innocent. I smell a bad smell. And what is this smell he has in mind? It's that they fall into error and go astray. In short, their childishness and childlikeness displays altogether this insufficient honesty. But while producing this insufficient honesty, every time you acknowledge or say in a conversation of the idea of truth, you would hear a grand and virtuous noise of these people. Why is he saying now? What is he saying here? Why would you hear a grand and virtuous noise of these childish and insufficient line SOBs? Because, as previously said, they're obsessed with the truth. They'll tie one truth to another truth while saying, if this truth is correct to this truth, but it's not correct to this truth, we can dispose and move this truth astray and aside and categorize that as bad. But if it becomes a issue, evil. You won't hear them, and again, you wouldn't hear them say, oh, this will to truth is this, this, and this. No, you would hear in their form of deceptive language, the will to truth. It becomes a puzzling and at the same time almost intolerable noise inside your head, because they'll say the words of a priori, posteriori, synthetic judgments, absolute truth, absolute intelligence, etc., from the idealists. And if you include, which Nietzsche did, he includes Spinoza with the mathematical hocus pocus or magic of these sober realists. In reality, these sober realists are artists in love, and that ties with the unconscious thinking. With the continuing of this virtuous and grand noise, they're preserving, evolving this, quoting, cold, pure, divinely unperturbed dialectic, in contrast to the mystics of every rank, which they speak of inspiration. There's a German idealist, I don't remember his name, and I'm paraphrasing his quote: "I will spread my ideas all over the place, and it will become a reality." Well, paraphrasing that, he's saying everything that I thought of, it's becoming a reality. And Nietzsche would say, oh, is it in this true world or in the apparent world? Which one was blindly added? Which one would become the savior or conqueror? Or villain, hero? Etc., etc. And a dialectic. There's one philosopher, well, multiple philosophers, but one philosopher in history that's obsessed with the dialectic. It's Hegel. And he evolved his dialect from Kant. And Kant evolved his dialect from multiple years or millennia of this dialect and movement that evolved after Plato. And Hegel appreciates and respects his dialectical form from Heraclitus, because of how Heraclitus decides to unite the opposites due to their separate but indifferent, air quoting, indifferent nature. That's how Hegel inserts his language to Heraclitus. And once we arrive at a passage or aphorism that has some Heraclitean phrasing and statements, I'll simplify what Nietzsche has to say in a Heraclitean sense. But we continue. Speak of these inspirations. But these inspirations, they occur as a prejudice, a notion, and he says in air quotes too, as an inspiration, a desire that the heart shifted and became abstract. While abstracting and stiffening the heart, they defend every reason that occurred after an event. So these advocates, cunning advocates, and pleading, cunning advocates of their prejudices, they still baptize these truths. But while baptizing these truths, they are distanced from possessing this confidence of their conscience, of comparing the knowledge that's stored inside their head to the abilities and wisdom of their body. So while it's a contradiction with Nietzsche, because he stored knowledge in his head too and compared that to his fragile body from the diseases, but as his not maid or butler or guardian that governed and watched Nietzsche for multiple years, I'm paraphrasing him too, he was awestruck that Nietzsche woke up early in the brisk and cold morning and walked for 2 hours plus straight. He would be exhausted, obviously, but while exhausted, he'd write what appeared in his mind. And what appeared in his mind is what I'm reading in front of you from a screen. So while far from possessing the confidence to realize that this isn't conscious to them, nor possessing a, quoting him, good taste of courage to publish this fact, make sure to warn a foe or a friend, or out of the high spirits to order to mock itself, or to continue to criticize, evaluate, and critique them. He says the contradiction of this stiff virtuousness, that old grand Kant, he lures with us still today with his dialectical paths which lead, more correctly, mislead to his categorical imperative. Why is it misleading? Correction on Nietzsche, misleading to the categorical imperative. Now, what's the categorical imperative? That's two scholarly words combined. Well, categorical, in a sense, is one's emphatic and still heels deep, hot heels deep stance, that they're unfazed and straight to the point. It's not solely a person, but an event, a categorical event. Imperative. What's an imperative? We hear this sometimes in politics, sometimes in religion, sometimes in science, and the scientists, while possessing that knowledge, can't define it themselves, so they use other words to simplify, and the grade system slips few points. But who's concerned with the grade system now? It's irrelevant. I included its relevancy. An imperative, say one's duty. That's the categorical imperative. A unconditional duty to what? There's a phrase that it comes from from Kant's Ethics. I'm paraphrasing a famous section of the categorical imperative of whatever you have done or acted on becomes your moral maxim, for that would be a universal maxim that would be your duty to act on. So while these morals and values you're acting on for yourself, translate those to universal maxims and morals or values, and it's your duty, crucial word, duty, to still act upon them. And you receive your joy if you do this. Say if Mark is virtuous, he'll be happy. Nietzsche says it's the reverse. If Mark is happy, he would be virtuous. And he says that in Twilight the Idols, inside the section of the 4 great errors, and including Kant of the 4 great errors of a false causality. Or is it false causality? False causality. It's one of the great errors, where if you do this to this, you'll become this and this. And he continues, this spectacle makes us smile. We who are facetious, or quickly to see and observe for ourselves, have a quick judgment for ourselves, have no little amusement in observing the tricks of these old moralists and preachers. And he includes Spinoza inside it with his hocus pocus of mathematical form, as if in iron, or inscribed in iron, or stone, that this Spinoza encast and masked his philosophy, the love of his wisdom. As the traditional definition of philosophy, the love of wisdom, Nietzsche includes the philosopher or the person himself. Well, today forward, depending on the context, I'll include the word philosopher, but today forward, I'll say the person. And Nietzsche includes the person plus the philosopher of loving their wisdom and unconcerned of other people's wisdom. To render that word fairly and squarely, it's a striking terror to the heart that attacks who should ever dare to glance at the invincible maiden in Pallas Athena, including the Greek mythos of Pallas, and the personal timidity and vulnerability this mask of sickness is reclusive and betrays. Concluding Aphorism 5. And now he's including he's saying timidity or weakness and shyness and this vulnerability of these mask-wearing sick, infected, metaphorically sick, infected, as I said earlier, with a virus, where if you reflect another person's philosophy, it's not you, you're dependent upon them, thus you're reflecting what they're saying. It's similar to how a child is to the parent. They reflect what the parent preaches, and them absorbing every singular piece and bit of information, wisdom, knowledge, either trustfully, cunningly, or blindly from the parent, thus them reflecting what the parent's philosophy and morality to them. And before the child's existence, reverse time to ages before that child, where the child's parent was reflecting their parents, etc., etc. It's a genealogical reflection of one century's mentality that evolved to another one, either drastic or statically. There, we use that word, statically. And that ties in with modern mentality of where if they explore something unexperienced, unknown, they're worried and anxious, began pushing, philosophizing, and questioning this worrying and anxious moment or event with an event previously to their mind, and they connect the two, so they alleviate the pressure of becoming another form of themselves or self-overcoming, etc., etc. Hence, the false judgment is not necessarily a objection to a judgment from Aphorism 4, and the degree of what is life advancing, preserving, species preserving and breeding, etc., etc. Now, that's everything I have to say with Beyond Good and Evil today. There's a link in the description to the Men's Academy. I'm inside the Men's Academy itself. It's a paid community monthly. There's another community, Masterminds, where you can develop your business with other entrepreneurs / YouTubers who are eager for you to compete with them and building your foundation of a company / business and compare it to theirs, etc., etc. Both paid communities monthly. Again, Men's Academy in the description. Like, comment, subscribe. What I included, what I excluded, and something I didn't see, how you saw it, questioning and evaluating me, etc., etc. Amor fati. Love your fate.